Hi, thanks for sticking with us through our final panel in the program. I'm very excited about this one. We have our esteemed panelists who promise I will let do all the talking because this is a pertinent topic that has a solution or many solutions, but it's going to take everyone to make it happen. Securing the supply chain is ever more important, as you may have heard through our previous sessions and as we've seen over the upheaval in our operations throughout the pandemic. Then, as government becomes more digital, baked-in security at all phases is mandatory. So we have here with us Katie Arrington, CISO for Acquisition and Sustainment at DoD, Will Loomis, Supply Chain Security Lead at the Atlantic Council, and Josh O'Sullivan, CTO at Artilist. Welcome all. Thanks for joining this morning. Let's start off now with the ever-present SolarWinds hack. Will, give us some context, and others jump right in whenever you feel is needed. What do recent security breaches like the SolarWinds hack mean for software and cloud supply chain? And what is government and our industry partners, what are they learning from this experience? Will?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And thanks to Government CIO for having us today. I'm really excited to come and talk about this issue. Yeah, first, the Sunburst SolarWinds operation was really high profile. We've seen it in the news. It's been covered all over the place. And we even had some congressional meetings focusing on it, which is rare for the issue of cybersecurity. And it's wide reaching. It hit a lot of folks across the public and the private sector, and it was pretty impactful. But technically, there wasn't really anything new with this compromise. So the campaign demonstrated the natural evolution in a trend of compromises that we've seen in some cases going back almost a decade. So the big thing here is enemies are looking to maximize the blast radius of their operations. And here we saw it in two ways. First, they exploited big, high-level, large-scale admin or security tool software with significant levels of permissions. So here they're going after SolarWinds. These types of systems provide great value for the enemy because of their ability through compromise of these systems to get deep into networks on a massive scale, particularly within the government. And this is not the first time we've seen these types of activities. The Atlantic Council's Breaking Trust project used a data set of 138 attacks and disclosures to look at attacks across the software supply chain going back about a decade. And we've seen things that have looked a lot like this before. Just to name a few, the 2017 CCleaner operation looked a lot like this, as well as Kingslayer, and the 2020 Able Desktop compromise also shared a lot of similar attributes to this. So, but the problem is these systems, despite being a huge pool of risk, aren't properly protected or equally protected for the amount of risk that they provide. The second thing here focuses more on cloud and less on these admin security tools. So for cloud, it's new in terms of scale and the level of effect as a target for adversaries. And we saw here that despite it being such an important tool in the security toolkit, it's not completely secure. So we saw here an exploit in the identity access management system for Microsoft's Azure Direct, which really let this attack become much more significant than it actually was, or than it could have been originally. So I think the data isn't, and I could be wrong here, but I think it's 40% of all the attacks or all the compromises in the SolarWinds Sunburst operation didn't actually came with clients and partners who didn't actually use SolarWinds. So this attack only became, or this operation only became so impactful because it utilized both of these targets that had such high blast radiuses. So just quickly, two key takeaways here. These operations demonstrated that we need to better understand that compromise is inevitable, and we need to be focusing on resiliency and not prevention as the key goal here. And second, that we need to think differently about how and what we prioritize when it comes to defense. The government needs to better understand what products we're using and how their networks are configured and set up. They need to identify what the biggest points of risk are and set up stronger and more layered levels of protection and monitoring. Prevention is impossible, but we need to focus on limiting that blast radius and shortening discovery times for these types of operations. And one thing quickly that I just need to tack on the end here, because I kick myself if I didn't mention it. We talked a little bit about the high blast radius of these types of targets. we can't let open source slip here. It wasn't part of Sunburst, which means it's not in the news and it's not something that we're focusing on, but it's a hugely under-defended attack vector that, similarly to admin software in the cloud, has a really massively wide blast radius and has been critically exploited in the past. We need to focus more on protecting open source. We can't let it slip behind and as we focus more on stuff like cloud and software supply chains, and it needs more funding and more institutional protection.
Here, because what we don't want to do, I'm sorry to jump in, is what the adversary expects us to do. SolarWinds and the impact that it has or is going to have, in future state, it shouldn't be that we stop moving forward. What we need to do is impart zero trust and have risk reduction strategies, because, you just stated, it's going to happen again. The likelihood, mathematically, scientifically, nothing is ever going to be 100% secure. So do your ardent best from the get-go to ensure that whatever software you're using or cloud instantiation, understand that you should have risk reduction built into that. DevSecOps, that whole initiative is about software security is continually baked in. It's continually evolving. If we get static and we just sit there and say, okay, this software is good today, and you put it out into an environment without risk reduction strategies around that, you're going to fall. And we need to just look at it that way. Over.
Great. Josh, anything to add?
Yeah, well, I yes, and when we look at the exploitation of SolarWinds by UNC 2452, Nibellum, there's a couple of different names floating around to describe that name set. I think one of the differences here that many have been kind of paying attention to is that this was a demonstration of a high tier adversary, and so the implications of their kind of TTPs and the necessity for a strategy to counter their kind of TTPs is slightly different than a 0-day or a crime of opportunity. And so, over time, we've struggled with saying, hey, is it worth the cost to be able to counter those kind of threats? And this is a demonstration of that. Yes, this is real, and it can have dire consequences, both in terms of scope and scale. I think we were very lucky in this campaign because this was a really an early period of a broader access campaign, espionage campaign, and the fact that FireEye found this is just substantive in terms of what it allowed for the rest of the community to see and understand.
This is also something the current administration is taking on. I mean, Will, you just told us this isn't the first major breach, but it is getting a lot of attention now, and it's prompting attention from the president as well. There's a couple executive orders on supply chain, but they're not focused on cloud and software specifically. From your perspectives, the three of you, how could you see technologies like the cloud being impacted down the line from an executive level?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I just wanted to quickly pick up on something that Katie said. She mentioned the zero trust model, and I am a big fan of zero trust. The idea is great, and it matches to what I said earlier in terms of we need to ID the biggest points of risk and limit the potential threats there and vulnerabilities. One thing I will say is there's not exactly like an enable zero trust button on your desk that you can just smash that makes everything really easy to put into effect. It's a pretty complicated process, and it's much easier said than done, and proper implementation of a zero trust model is pretty challenging. And I think that there's a little bit of a lack of expertise in this area in the federal workforce, particularly for cloud. So I'm a huge proponent of zero trust, and definitely something that we should push for. We just need to make sure that we're giving it the proper time to support implementation and the proper resources to do so. And just quickly to answer your question about what should the executive focus on. As you mentioned, some of the the recent supply chain executive orders that have come out, don't really affect cloud significantly. And there's been some rumors that there's another one coming down the pipeline. You don't exactly know what's going to be in there, but just a couple things that that we said in the report that we think that should be focused on by the executive and by the federal government. Ruthlessly prioritizing risk. So this goes up to what we were talking about earlier. We need to think differently and critically about where the biggest points of risk lie within our federal government IT, and make sure that we're focusing on those areas. We need to continue to expand and codify partnerships with the private sector. And this is particularly important around cloud. With that shared risk model and a lot of that infrastructure being hosted by private sector entities and hyperscalers, it's even more important that we interact and tie our work closely into the private sector. And I think that's most evident by, I think it was Kevin Mandia talking about in the congressional briefings where he said, hey, once we got all the right people in the room who were affected, it was pretty easy to figure out where this was coming from and where the attacking points were. So, just making sure that they work a lot with the private sector to make sure that that information exchange and threat exchange is happening and is happening as quickly as possible is a big thing. And then, we can talk a little bit more later in the discussion about some of the existing programs focusing on standards and security in these areas. But I think we just need to push to make those programs a little bit more accessible, a little bit more implementable, and a little bit less overly restrictive going forward.
So on that point, one of the things that I've been talking about in the past 2 years, talking throughout the nation about cybersecurity. But one of the core tenets of talking about that and bringing that discussion point is that threat should not be, and risk. Risk is a 4-letter word, but we need to get better at understanding how to information share across the federal agencies with our commercial counterparts on what threat and risk are. And prioritization, there's only so much that you can do. And the zero, getting to zero trust easy button, I 100% agree. But it's that thought process, that critical thinking that we need to start embedding, that threat and risk will continually evolve, and that nothing that you do is going to be that you can't put a marker in the ground and say, I'm good, walk away. It's got to be, what are you doing to ensure that you're doing the best today, because the adversaries' TTPs will evolve and change, to buy down the risk down the line. And when it comes to software, I've said it a few times, there's two types of developers, and it's not a bad thing. It's either you didn't know you built a vulnerability in the code, in the development of the application, or you did. And I think a lot of what we're trying to get our arms around are, in software development, the standards are, we need to make them so that we understand who is coming into the environments to develop, especially within the Department of Defense, where there's a program here called, Ski Camp, where we put developers through a curriculum before they actually go to develop on a weapon system. Things like that are what we need to put our resources to, so that we can get to a better level. Zero trust, no doubt. It's very expensive. We don't have the workforce to support it, but strategically, that's the goal we should go to in building risk in. And part of building risk in is the availability to information share, what threat, what risk is, what it means, and know that it's happening to you, just like we've seen with the solar winds. It's probably happening to somebody else. And, the amount of work to overcome something, it's a heck of a lot more effective with the masses than the eaches. Over.
Yeah, I actually quickly, Josh, sorry, I just wanted to foot stomp one thing Katie said. She said that it's important for us to work with the private sector to think forward about what that threat modeling process is going to continue to look like. And I just want to say that is essential. Looking at, where the threats have surfaced, going back over the course of the last 3, 4, 5 years, and thinking about how we can protect from those threats are going to put us in a horrible position. We need to be looking forward and positioning ourselves to make sure that we are positioned for the next level, a next tier of threats, not the ones that have come in the past.
Right, and you do that by building out a feedback loop, right? So we're working through continuous monitoring is always an interesting conversation of what you're doing and not doing. And what we're starting to find is there's this shift kind of in what's occurred because of the pandemic, right? So Sachin Nadella was talking a while ago about we are now at peak centralization. So going forward, we should be expecting our computing environments to be more distributed, more decentralized, more composable. And when we talk about zero trust, it's interesting because there's a lot of conversations about getting rid of network security, but it's actually doubling down on instrumentation network security. So it's moving the boundary towards the endpoint, towards the user, towards the identity and the persona. And so the instrumentation necessary to understand the user, their infrastructure, be it the endpoint, the data, the application, right, the services, the cloud, that's a lot of data to collect in itself, right? And that kind of data is persistent both privately and publicly. And so how we're working across that, right? These name sets, right? These adversaries, we like to make them sound like Superman, but they're not. They're in the invisible name, right? So as soon as we can see them, they're actually more at harm than anybody else. And so how we do that though is one, we have to get to infrastructure that have the proper information and instrumentation built in. I think that's an opportunity with cloud. Right? We've kind of gotten to this place here where it used to be all on-prem, all behind the firewall, and I don't think we're going back to that. I think we're going to live in a remote-first kind of world. And so, what does that mean now going forward? What's that mean in terms of the infrastructure and the compliance? We get super excited around the cybersecurity maturity model certification because it's a new kind of model where it's based on the maturity of your organization and how much we can trust you. It's based on how you're using that intelligence, right? And when we talk about not just what good hygiene is from levels 1 through 3, but actually about what you're doing from incorporating that threat intelligence into your apparatus. So we're super excited, especially about level 4 and 5 becoming more pervasive, both inside and outside of government.
Me too. That, Josh, when we get there, that'll be the moment. And we in the Department of Defense, the CMMC, we're still, that is really a game changer. But levels 4 and 5, really, when you start to bake in what threat is, and how do you take it and extrapolate it, it's huge. But you both are refreshing. I love the conversation, and those people who are on the call today, you didn't get to be in the segues up to this where it was just we're trying to hold back so we don't kill you in the time here, because there's so much to this. This is not, and Will, you said at the beginning, right? We need to resource this. Mm-hmm. You can't find hardware that is not software enabled. So think about that, right? It's the basis of 99% of what we're doing these days. And to take that, we really need to change the paradigm of how we're thinking about things. On-prem, to create, capability on-prem, the amount of money that it takes to build that, right, is ultimately, if the private sector does it, it's going to come back to the government and the taxpayer. And I'm going to tell you, I'm more in line with the CFP doing it, right? And having that I would much rather focus on protecting this than all of that. Right. And that's where we need to start thinking about how do we move. Now, not to say that companies shouldn't go and develop that capability on their own organically if they think it's the best, but for the taxpayer and for, the fact that the nation state attacks that are coming at us, the terrorists that are focused on us, to culminate and come together, I believe it's really one of the only ways that we're going to be able to take this next step is, I say on DoD calls, one team, one fight. And the fight here isn't about anything other than ensuring that you, the companies out there who, in my world, are our national defense, that we need you, are at the same level set as the internal government as well. And I think, Will, everything that you guys have done, and Josh, everything, and for those people, I've met Josh 2 years ago at a trade show. You were standing in a booth in Charleston, South Carolina. It's where we've come has been massive in 2 years, right? Think about the Atlantic Council, Will. What we were talking 2 years ago, we were talking about 5G, right? and how that was going to change. And all of us on this call today knew the paradigm was shifting. We saw it, and it's so refreshing that our freak flag, our cyber policy wonk freak flags can fly now, and we're taken seriously that this is real. The adversary's capability to come at us is real. SolarWinds only says what we have been foot stomping for years, saying you are as much at risk for being on this call today, because think about it, you're all interconnected. Think about it. We have to get good. We're at the paradigm. Our nation, if we don't make the pivot now, and I applaud the administration for coming out, working on this. If we don't make the pivot now, then we will not be successful. And we've got to take this big, giant step. And Dazzy Salazar, my new boss, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Industrial Policy, he said something yesterday. He's like, it's like moving this carrier, and we are 2 degrees in moving to the right. How are we going to make sure the momentum? Will, your thing about resourcing absolutely is part of the fuel. The second part is the communication, and keeping up the fight. Sorry, I get so impassioned about this. Amy's just sitting there so patiently.
This is fantastic. I'm not complaining at all. But I do want to go into a little bit, Katie, you bring up CMMC. How can standards defined by programs like that, or FedRAMP or NIST, et cetera, how can they ensure cloud security? And is there anything agencies need to do more, have to take action on, maybe immediately from a security side, separate from just mere compliance?
Absolutely. So the FedRAMP certification first is to make sure that the CSP is meeting the requirements set out to do the best to provide security. But if your C-suite isn't talking about how important this is, and bringing in your CTO, your CISO, and by the by, I love IT, but if you have an IT networking person, they're not a cyber security person necessarily. And you need to think about that, right? Your business is running on a CSP. You should take that conversation into the C-suite and find out what certifications your CSP provider has, make sure they're current and up to date, have a dialogue with them. This is a CEO conversation. This is not a business manager discussion. Yeah. And it's got to be at that board level, and take it seriously because your businesses depend on it. I had a phone call yesterday with a construction company that was out in the Midwest, why they needed cyber. And they're talking about it. So it needs to be brought to the CMMC is not a checklist about compliance. It is about critical thinking about cybersecurity. The FedRAMP is to give you an assurance that they're meeting the federal standards of security, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't ask what it is you're providing me, and making sure, the third thing is look at the products. We tend to buy a Maserati and drive it like a Ford. That is a big thing that a lot of us forget, is that when we go into the government, we buy by requirement. You're getting all these additional features of software and capability. Ask the question on both sides. What else does this do? How many people realize their Microsoft Office suite has antivirus, and then they go out and they buy antivirus? You've got to have this conversation, but there's a lot to be done. To crawl, walk, run. We're in the middle of the marathon. Don't give up. Put the right resourcing to it. If anything in the pandemic, it showed you that your networking capability, your security when you're able to be mobile is essential. And how do you provide that for your companies and do it in the most secure fashion? And I can't, unless you're going to create on-prem, CSPs are the way to go. Just make sure you're using them correctly. Over.
So I guess just quickly, I'll play devil's advocate here and push back just a little bit. I definitely think that, FedRAMP and CMMC and other standards programs like that, they're a great start. They're a step in the right direction, and they show that we're thinking about these problems, in the right way, and we're pushing towards a solution. But as, many folks have mentioned today throughout the other panels, these programs can be pretty sophisticated, they can be pretty complex, and they can be a little slow moving. So, just two things that I'd want to put forward. I think it's important to recognize that these types of programs don't necessarily completely solve the issue. So both Orion and Azure were compliant with what they needed to be compliant with, and still ended up getting compromised. Also, the complexity and overlapping nature of some of these programs makes implementation pretty difficult on the private sector side. So, and for the federal government, there's that infamous GAO report that's gone around that kind of shows that there's some struggle within federal agencies to implement some of those existing best practices. And it could help to condense, clarify, and coordinate some of these existing programs to make baseline security goals more clear and more implementable at scale, particularly for smaller organizations. So think state level government, think smaller private sector actors. It's not everyone's huge and as Katie said, has the resources to throw at the problem. And for cloud particularly, implementation of cloud services creates their own problems. So we talk a lot about purchasing and procurement, but we also need to regulate how products are used and set up, and particularly for the cloud. And I think FedRAMP is probably the best vehicle to do that going forward. So yeah, just in summary, I think that these standards programs are like a great first step and are really pushing us in the right direction. But we do need to think critically about how we can use these programs to be a little bit quicker, a little bit more balanced, a little bit more agile, and and thus less complex going forward in order to attack those highest points of risk. That's me.
Yeah, and to add on to that, having started a company several years ago to try to help the dev improve their cybersecurity before CMMC, right, when it was just this NIST mandate, it was nearly impossible. And trying to have a business conversation, right? When we start a customer, we spend about a week going through with their senior executives, doing a risk breakdown. So the understanding that this isn't about them being compliant, it's about how they're using their technology and transitioning their IT investment into an IT asset. It's also important to point out that as we talk about these different infrastructures we rely on, the differences in exploitation against SolarWinds, where and the Orion platform versus what occurred with Azure, that was more of an identity TTP after exploitation. And so that chaining effect is really important. And the feedback loops that Microsoft has built in cause a difference in terms of containing how bad that occurrence could be. The other part here is that as we get going, there is this space in between, right? Of why do you need to be a cybersecurity expert to be able to defend your business? If I was a king for the day, there's this big, hairy, audacious goal we need to set. I'd almost say a 100x improvement here, because we need to be 10 times faster in terms of what it takes to go through some of these certification and assessment processes, but also we need to make it 10 times cheaper, right? So 10x, cost and time. But to get there, what does that mean? That means inheritance. So if we can rely on the cloud security stacks, right, and be able to give those enough of reciprocity into the customer base, then that means we can be quicker in terms of our assessments, we can be quicker in terms of going through and getting certifications. And then also it means that we can have a more robust set of instrumentation underneath it that creates those feedback loops, feeds into that continuous monitoring, feeds into that threat intelligence feedback.
Those are great points, Josh. Thank you. And you bring up some valid concerns that are real as agencies are getting into this digital reality and incorporating more technologies like cloud. Securities and the cost of security is a concern. So I want to close out this last minute by asking all of you, what are the opportunities ahead as we're dealing with these concerns and possible executive orders, policies that come out? How can agencies and businesses really make secure solutions affordably and efficiently for national security? Katie?
So I will say this. The Department of Defense, CMMC, a rising tide raises all boats. So we have said that security is an allowable cost. We're going out to, get third-party certs so that we can assure you have the critical thinking about cybersecurity. That, I think the rising tide raises all boats. All the federal government is working towards getting the collective better. What DHS CISA is doing, their ICT on supply chain, those processes, the continued communication for all of us, because we're not going to solve this problem alone, is an imperative. The communication between the commercial sector and what they're doing, communicating it to the federal government, and taking that lapse of time that tends to go from policy to actually implementation, 5-year low to a 2-day low, right? That's a big thing. Policy trickle down into making actually something happen. We've got to shorten that gap. If that's anything that we do, is shorten that gap.
Will, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, honestly, I mean, I agree with Katie on a lot of the points she made. I would just add that for me, I think it's really important that we continue to think about where the biggest points of risk and particularly consolidated risk live within our systems. So whether it's cloud, whether it's massively high used admin tools like SolarWinds, just as an example, or even as I mentioned earlier, talking about open source and how that plays into development. We need to think forward about these threat models. We need to, and particularly within the government, we need to have a really good sense of what is in our systems and where we are vulnerable and where the biggest areas of consolidated risk are, and then we need to be quick, agile, and honestly as sustained as possible at monitoring and protecting those. Again, and as I said this at the top, prevention is not a realistic goal. What we need to focus on is making our systems and our processes resilient. So, the next time something like SolarWinds Sunburst comes around, we discover it quicker and we can get them out of our network faster.
Fantastic. Well, we are out of time, but
if I may, just very, very quickly.
Sure, go ahead.
There's a difference here with CMMC, because it isn't an IT security problem. It made it a business problem, and so we have these embers that we have to protect and grow it into what it needs to become. That forces the maturity in organizations, right? And so if we don't get that part nailed and solidified and growing, we're going to have huge problems. And so, I'm just very appreciative of what's going on, what's been accomplished in the last year, and I think what we're going to get accomplished here in the future years.
There's definitely a lot of moving parts that we're all going to keep an eye on, and I'm sure we could have gone on another 30 minutes or even longer, but I got to stop us. So thank you so much for joining us. Katie, welcome back. And hopefully we'll get some movement on these dire security issues and prevent them in the future. And I think this is a good discussion on how that can be accomplished immediately. So thank you all.